Hey everyone, and welcome back to another video. So, I'm always really curious about how much DPS we're going to be doing in any upcoming expansion, so I've decided to test it out a little bit in the dungeon content of Legion. This stuff is done at level 110, they actually scale you up to max level, and our item level is scaled up to 810. Now, I'm using numbers from the Halls of Valor practice runs that I did with Fat Boss, Kelric, and Trekkie for the Legion Dungeon Race. That's a live stream that's taking place on the 11th of February. The footage that I'm using here isn't from those runs, though, because we're not showing off our strategies, but you can only see the bosses that I'll be talking about. So I'm going to be comparing a few different boss fights on my Marksmanship Hunter, both with and without artifact traits, and just from, numbers that other people have been telling me from their raid testing. Artifact traits will impact the DPS of the different classes to varying degrees, and it actually has quite a large impact on the Marksmanship Hunter. While we're unable to use add-ons on the alpha, what we can do is combat logs. So what I did is I started a combat log, uploaded it to Warcraft logs, and used that to get these numbers. Those logs, of course, are private because they are from our practice runs, and we can't really be giving things away. So, the first fight I'm going to look at is Hiraja in the Halls of Valor. My average DPS on 3 attempts of this fight as a Marksmanship Hunter without artifact traits was 89k. After upgrading my artifact, the average went up to 165k, but bear in mind we were using heroism with a bunch of skilled players, and the boss was dying very quickly. On a longer, more sustained fight, DPS would have been lower. What is interesting is the impact of the artifact weapon traits. They're not all balanced at the minute, and MM is performing really strongly due to its ability to access some key DPS traits within their first picks on the artifact weapon. There are, of course, many more artifact weapon traits and runes that we will have access to when Legion comes out. This means that overall DPS will almost certainly be higher than, say, 165k that I was able to pull here. Additionally, we were not using pots, flasks, food, or gems. Moving on to Hiraja. Look, J's, they're fun in Nordic languages anyway. I did an average of 127k DPS without the artifact weapon and 166k with the artifact weapon. We're seeing a very similar pattern to the last time. And let's move on to Odin, who is the final boss of the Halls of Valor. I actually couldn't find a pug that would get to him, so I'm just using a screenshot from our practice run. Now, what's special about him is he's got a 50% increased damage phase. Without the artifact weapon, I did 133k DPS, and with the artifact weapon, I did 255k DPS. The artifact weapon really powers up the Hunter's cooldown ability, which explains the massive increase in damage, because you'd ideally be using that whenever Odin has his 50% increased damage taken phase. Now, I haven't done any raid testing, but Alex and Loz mentioned people doing around 100k plus as the average during raids, and overall from my dungeon runs, I'm finding players are on average doing between 50 and 100k in most fights. Of course, it is very early on, it's still technically in the alpha, right? So this is to get a ballpark figure in terms of the numbers. I think we're going to be doing between 150k to maybe 250k as our average kind of amount of DPS once we hit Legion, once we're using full artifact weapons, pots, flasks, and things like that, and the classes are fully balanced. So let's look back at Warlords. Warlords of Draenor started off with people doing 20 to 30k DPS in, say, dungeons and high mall, but by the end, people were doing insane damage due to rings and trinkets, often 10 times as much damage as launch. Seriously, I've seen reports of Mythic Iron Reaver going down in under 30 seconds because of the legendary ring. Now, Mop started us off with doing, 60k roughly in the early bosses? Now, DPS on Garrosh was often in excess of 300k, with Warlocks going way above that. Wow, some of the Warlock numbers were crazy. So, if the average damage during this raid tier is, as an example, 150k, and it balloons to 5 times that amount as the expansion goes on, then players will be doing by the end 750k DPS. If the average amount was, say, 250k damage, then maybe we're doing 1.25 million damage per second by the end of this expansion. Now, what is very interesting to me is that Blizzard are doing a lot of crazy-ass Diablo loot when it comes to this expansion. Is that going to mean we're going to have procs which are absolute madness that change how specs play in a very significant way and lead to extreme power creep? Are we going to have the legendary items that they're planning on putting in basically lead to loads of insane power increases? It's very hard to say how those things are going to play out. Suffice to say, I think DPS is going to be above 750, maybe, most likely I'd say above 1 million damage per second by the time we reach the end of Legion. And that does really allude to the larger topic of numbers and game design and things like that. I'll get into that a different day. Suffice to say, I was happy enough doing 1500 damage and, maybe doing 5000 later on. That felt pretty good to me. So if we could go back to those older numbers, I'd be pretty happy. Anyway, guys, that's it for this video. Hope you found it interesting. Let me know roughly how much DPS you think players should be doing, and I'll see you next time.